welcome to HN Reads. I'm Gretchen Lyda, here with the August edition of our show where we talk to authors who've written books about horses. This month, we have the amazing Jim Wofford with his new book, Still Crazy, Horse Crazy After All These Years. He's a 3-time Olympian. He's also an eventing coach, the author of many, many books, which you can find at Equishopper, and an eventing legend. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much, Gretchen.
Thank you so much for being here. So one of the questions I was thinking about as I was preparing to meet with you is, I was thinking a lot about your title, Still Horse Crazy After All These Years. And I was wondering what it is about eventing that has kept you involved in it for so long.
I think eventing fascinated me because you had to combine so many different skills. You cover a wide range of the spectrum of the horse's abilities. If you imagine a spectrum from racing to pure dressage, we occupy, 2/3 of that spectrum because we're working in collection these days. And sometimes cross country at the upper levels, you're going almost at racing speed. I've done both ends of the spectrum. I was always drawn more to the speed than I was to the collection. And I've had several coaches point that out at the wrong time because I had a nasty habit of substituting speed for ideas. Speed and impulsion are not the same thing.
And would you say that that's common among eventing riders, is that they usually have a need for speed, or they're ones that are more into dressage?
I think these days it's more that they are intrigued by the skill set that's required, because when we talk about what I did as an eventer and what people do these days, it's not even apples to oranges. It's two entirely different types of sport, two very different types of horse, and really two different types of rider. These riders these days are highly technically skilled and admirable with what they can do. We were a different animal. We, the eventers of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, that was a different sport entirely.
Mm-hmm. How was it different?
In the classic format that was in place from basically 1912 to 2004, eventing was a dressage test, followed by what they then called the speed and endurance phase. And that was a total of over 20 miles. You would have a 15 to 30 minute warm-up trot on roads and tracks. And then you would do about a 2.5 mile steeplechase. This, I'm talking about the Olympic and World Championship level now, of course. And we would be on that steeplechase phase at 690 meters a minute for 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Now imagine they did at cross-country speed, the Olympics was what was at 7:45 or 8 minutes roughly. So we were moving at steeplechase speed for almost as long as the Olympic horses were going that we saw last week in Tokyo. And many of them were quite tired. And our horses were still pulling at the end of that 2.5 miles. So you can see right away, we're talking about a different creature. And then, as I say, the classic format went on to another roads and tracks phase. And this would be anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes of walk, trot, and canter on country roads, through fields, and so on, followed by a 5-mile cross-country course. And that would be at the same speed as they were required to go in Tokyo this past week, over the same size jumps. And then we would come back and show jump the third day. What made it different? The endurance aspect of the sport made it very, very different. We don't test the horses' endurance these days so much as we test their technical training. So nowadays, the ratio of difficulty of the sport is 1 to 1 to 1, 1 part dressage, 1 part cross country, 1 part show jumping. You can't exactly measure it, but that's a way to conceive of it these days, that you can't really make up. If you're really deficient in one phase, you're not going to be very successful at the upper level, because those people are really, really proficient at all 3 phases. As I say, not even apples to apples, different sports.
Yeah, they sound
apples
like
to oranges.
Right? Apples to apples, right? No, apples to oranges is a much better metaphor. A note to our audience, if you have any questions for Jim, please leave them in the comments box. We would love to hear your questions. The other thing to talk about too is that this book is chock full of kind of all of these different experiences throughout eventing and horses in general, starting with your father. Can you describe your father a little bit for us?
My father was a lifelong Army officer, graduated from West Point 101 years ago, this year, 1920, and was in the cavalry all his life. He was a student of one of our greatest horsemen, Harry D Chamberlain. General Chamberlain is the man who really invented the training of the modern sport horse, the combination of the Caprilli forward seat, which was revolutionary 100 years ago. And he combined that with French and German dressage training techniques to produce the sport horse that you and I recognize now. So my father did that. He rode in the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles. He went on then to coach the jumping team and the eventing team in 1952 in Helsinki, Finland, at the Olympics there, and was the first president, founding member of the U.S. equestrian team. So as you can say, a lifelong horseman, both in the horses and in the administrative part of it. And I kind of followed in his footsteps.
Wow, what a legacy. One of the things too is that you grew up right outside of Fort Riley. What was Fort Riley like?
Fort Riley was at that time what was called the Cavalry School. And this is where officers were brought to learn not just how to ride, because they had already been through the Army's riding program, but this was the instructor's school, because the officers had to go back to the various cavalry posts around the country and teach the troopers how to ride according to the Army way. You know, the old joke is there's a right way, there's a wrong way, and there's the Army way. And the Army way is when you take away the uniforms and so on, the techniques and theories that they used would be very familiar to the people who are listening into this webcast right now.
Can you give an example of a way from the Army way that you still use in your own coaching?
Oh, sure. Keep the weight in your ankles.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Describe it more.
Anyone that's jumped has done any kind of jumping has heard that comment and has applied that comment to their own riding and felt their jumping position improve as a result.
Yeah.
And that's Harry D. Chamberlain, his teachings and theories. He's an interesting guy. He's a real American hero. He learned to ride. He's a class of 1905 at West Point, and he learned a very rigid, upright, backward. You and I would view it, Gretchen, as backward position. The rider was supposed to lean back and pull on the reins when the rider jumped in order to keep the horse from stumbling when it landed. So it's a very restrictive, very abusive posture, and yet that's what the Army taught, and that's what every cavalry around the world taught until along came an Italian named Caprilli. And Federico Caprilli, in about 1895, started changing the methodology. So you've heard of the term the forward seat. Mm-hmm. He is really the inventor of the forward seat. Harry Chamberlain, Army cavalry officer, was sent abroad. He fought in World War I, was sent abroad after the war, after World War I, to study equitation. And he spent a year in Italy. He spent 6 months in France at Saumur. He spent some time at St. Petersburg, the Imperial Riding School in Russia, at that time Russia. I think he spent some time in Britain at their cavalry school called Wheaton. And I've always laughed. I've never seen his 201 file, his personnel file, but I'd be very surprised if his time in England did not coincide with the fox hunting scene over there, because he loved fox hunting. So he did all this over a 2 or 3 year period, and then the Army brought him home and said, "Okay, write down what you have learned, and we will make that the Army system." So later General Chamberlain invented this modern position that combined the freedom, the forward movement of the Italian system with the dressage and responsiveness, especially of the French. He was very enamored of the French school of equitation, and that. You have to study these various books, but you can see how he synthesized this, and you can see why I call him an American equestrian genius. And so he not only did he form this, of course, he had learned to ride a totally different way, and he changed himself, his own riding technique, based on what he had learned, especially in Italy, but later on in France and so on. And that's the basis of put your weight in your ankles, because it solidifies the rider's lower leg position when they're galloping and jumping. And when we have a solid lower leg position, we can do other things without worrying about falling off. So that's a very long question to a very short answer. What do I mean that Chamberlain permeates the work that we do today? That's why.
And it's crazy because when you think about the forward seat, it seems like that's just how you're supposed to ride. Like that seems like a given, and it's not even that old. Like
yes, I mean it's basically 80 years old now in this country.
All right, we have our first reader question. You ready for it?
Sure.
All right. So Jim, did that adrenaline rush attract you to eventing?
Oh yeah, I mentioned the speed earlier, Carol. I did some steeplechase riding. I always struggled with making the weight, and I really loved it, especially timber riding, because you're going quite fast at big solid obstacles, and I got a real charge out of that. But the problem with racing is, for the most part, the fastest horse wins. And the rider's ability to influence the outcome is far more limited than your ability to apply skill and practice to the sport of eventing. And that, along with the combined nature of the sport, that's what brought me to emphasize eventing in my career.
Fantastic. One of the things I was thinking about as you were describing the forward seat is that you mentioned the book that you often felt completely comfortable with just a book when you were traveling around and are a big reader. Are there books that you would recommend to the audience that they should read, along with yours, of course?
Along with mine, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking about jumping? Or are we talking about dressage?
Yes.
Yes, we are. Well, we start with dressage because you have to always start with dressage. The first really serious book on dressage that I read is a book that is still available. You can buy a very, very cheap edition at bookstores and at Amazon.com. It's called Riding Logic by a man named Wilhelm Museler, Museler. And he is the clearest delineation you're going to find of the German system of dressage training, which is very, very, very correct. What we think of as Germanic is not what Wilhelm Mussler is talking about. That's a very soft, very sympathetic. We think of German riding as being a bit stiff, a bit kick and pull. That's not at all true. When you watch the gold medal team 2 weeks ago at Tokyo, the German ladies that did all the good there, there's nothing heavy or forced about that. That's a lovely, lovely system because they have come back around. Part of that has to do with I think, as an onlooker of dressage at that level, the dressage breeders have done such a good job of producing the type of sport of horse that you need for this sport at the upper levels. Now, these are very active horses, very, very forward, lovely athletes, and then they've been put through this very, very thorough, disciplined system that the Germans have, and they produce a very attractive result. And if you want to see it in eventing, all you have to do is watch Ingrid Klimke and Michael Young and Sandra Alfarth, all of the German top eventing riders. Their dressage is just impeccable. And again, there's nothing heavy or forced about it. It's a very, very lovely, soft, sympathetic system.
And they're basing it off of the riding logic.
They're basing it off of, don't get me started about riding theory. The man who really invented the German system in about 1858 is a man named Gustav Steinbrecht. And you have to really love theory, and you really have to want to read about horses to read Gymnasium das Pferd. It has been translated into English. It was written in the 1850s, and the Germans redid their rules of grammar and syntax sometime after that. So this is a very clunky book. Any book that has a paragraph that extends for a page and a half, that's going to be slow going. So I don't recommend that. Riding Logic is a lovely translation, and very, very readable, very sensible, very logical. For jumping, there's a book called Riding and Schooling by Harry D. Chamberlain, printed in 1935. Again, there are any number of trade issues available to you at a very reasonable price, and you should sleep with that book under your pillow, because that is how to ride horses over terrain in the show jumping arena, cross country. This will tell you how to do it.
Do you keep a copy with you?
I have copies on my, you can't quite see my desk, the shelves next to my desk here. They're stuffed with hundreds of horse books. And all of them have little things sticking out of them, because I've marked if I have one passage that I want to recommend to a student in the morning, and I know where it is, but I can't quote the page number to the student, and I'm going to go look that up tonight. It's in a book called Reflections on Riding and Jumping by a man named William Steinkraus. He's our first individual gold medal winner in show jumping. And he has written a couple of lovely books. They're not for the average audience. Steinkraus's mind, his intellect was not for us average people. You have to be a real student. And when he uses a word, if he uses an unusual word, he is quoting from Webster's dictionary. So he's very specific about how he states some things. He never talks about a show jumping rider finding a stride, because find implies serendipity, and there's nothing that's coincidental or serendipitous in the way Steinkraus rode. He talks about arranging a stride, because you arrange something like a musical piece to arrive at a predetermined outcome. And when Steinkraus turned toward a jump, he was galloping towards a predetermined outcome. He knew where that horse was going to leave the ground far before the horse knew where he was going to leave the ground. Lovely book, but I'm just making a point that these books are not here in my bookshelf for show. They are there for continual reference.
And we have a question real quick. Could you repeat the second title of the book you mentioned about jumping?
Yes, it's called, Chamberlain has two books. I slightly prefer Riding and Schooling. Harry D. Chamberlain. His other book, which was published in 1937, is called Training Hunters, Jumpers, and Hacks. And by that, he meant pleasure horses, right? Horses that we would just ride out for pleasure, not necessarily compete with.
All right, so this is a little bit of an inside baseball question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When you're writing books where you're talking about a how-to of a sport like, eventing, dressage, show jumping, how do you take something that physical and put it on the page? If that makes sense.
One word at a time.
Yeah.
Right?
Tell me more.
You decide what it is that you want to have the rider do, and then you describe that position. What do I mean? In describing the dressage position that I teach horses and riders, I want the rider to sit in a vertical line at the halt, ear, shoulder, hip, and heels. That should be in a straight line. I want the rider to maintain a straight line from their elbow in contact with the horse's mouth. And I want the heels lower than the toes. The stirrup leather should be vertical at all times. And that describes, now you can see that. Then I would go on to say, once the rider has achieved this, the weight of their body should rest on 3 points in the deepest part of the saddle. There are 3 points involved in the dressage position, the 2 seat bones and the pubic bone, not the coccyx. That puts the rider behind. When they slump and they press on the back of their buttocks, when the horse moves out from underneath him. So you see this, the text describes, without photos or diagrams, what it is that I'm looking for. And the rider can then take that. I'm not the only rider that uses this book, Riding Logic for a Bible. Bill Roycroft was on the gold medal team in 1956 1960 at Rome for the Australian eventing team. And he was an Australian cowboy who got interested in eventing for some reason. And he would ride around in the summer with his shirt off, probably in blue jeans and cowboy boots, practicing this newfangled sport that he had discovered. And he would keep a copy of Riding Logic tucked in the small of his back, because it said it did 2 things. It made him keep his back straight, the way Musler did. We'd ride with a straight back and a slight arch in the small of the back. And it also, he would pull up and say, now, wait a minute, what did this man say about half pass? What is this half pass? And he would open the book right there, which I'm sure by now is sweat stained. And see, and he would review that part of dressage riding, tuck it into his back, and away he would go. I'm not the only person that thinks Riding Logic is terrific.
That's a publishing question, but is it like like I'm picturing it in the back of his pants? Was it a short book, or was it?
No, it was standard. What's the standard? 8.5 by 11 or something like that. Yeah, that's standard, and probably 200 pages long. You're not sticking Webster's dictionary in the small of the bag.
So this is we're going to switch topics just a little bit here and talk a little bit more about specific horses. Some of these are famous ones, some of them are not. Some of these places are famous ones, some of them are not. So the first thing I want you to talk about is Merrylegs. We're going to start from the very beginning. Could you describe Merrylegs for us?
Yes, Merrylegs, a Shetland pony, black and white, typical for the breed and type. Taught my 3 siblings how to ride. taught me how to ride, gave me my first jumping experience because my brothers were much older than I was. They were 9 and 13 years older. And one day I was probably 3 years old, 4 years old. They were leading me on Merrylegs. And I remember where we were on our farm. We had a big 10-acre field next to the stables that we used for a horse exercise area. And down at the far end, there was a little cross rail, which was probably 12 inches, all of 12 inches. And these two bozos, my older brothers, decided it would be fun to lead me over the cross rail. So that's my first jumping effort that I remember. But of course, I was riding a stock saddle, hanging onto it with both hands, onto the pommel with both hands. Merrylegs, probably being in their mid-20s by this time, she had no enthusiasm whatsoever. So they led her up to this and she shuffled up to it and then pop jumped over it. Well, of course, the pommel came up and hit me straight in the nose. And I bled like, you know what, all over the place, squalling, of course, at the indignity of it all. And I remember my two brothers standing and looking back over their shoulder at me and basically just shrugging and say, "It's not broken, kid. Quit crying." And they just walked on leading the horse because Daddy had told them to go set some jumps at the far corner of the field. And they put me on Merrylegs basically so they could kind of keep track of me because I was highly mobile at that age. So that's Merrylegs. We used to take her to horse shows and she would walk into the back of the station wagon and stand spraddling the transmission bump. And then we would lead her out the other side. I was not present, but I'm told my middle brother led her upstairs one day. And he was probably 10 or 12 at the time. And it took my father and two grown men to get her back downstairs again because she did not want to go downstairs.
Oh, no.
That's Merrylegs.
So the other horses also surprised me a little bit. It's an Appaloosa. Atos. I wanted you to talk about that one too.
Yes. My first advanced horse. He was a roan Appaloosa. He had been found. He was owned by some Nez Indians in Colorado, and he bucked all of the young braves off. They couldn't ride him, so they sold him cheap to a friend of ours, and she got him tame, got him jumping. He was quite talented. He was very independent, as one would think. There, he's about 15.3, and he was a wonderful jumper if you let him jump. Just point him and make sure you had enough speed, but sit still and shut up, because the minute you tried to tell him what to do, he was going to turn around and argue with you. He never bucked with me. They got that out of him before I got him. I needed a horse to ride for the 1965 talent squad at Gladstone, New Jersey, because I'd been selected for that. So my mother purchased him and sent me back, and I showed up at Gladstone, which was then the mecca of riding for this talent search. Took place in New Jersey in August, hot as blazes. And here I come out of the farmlands of Kansas with an Appaloosa. So I'm sure there was a little head scratching going on. But anyway, he was the only horse I had to ride, and there it was. So I started. That was my first advanced horse, Atos. And
you actually segued beautifully into one of the things I wanted to talk about, which was Gladstone. Can you talk about your time there?
As I mentioned, I was picked for the talent squad. In those days, we did not have the extensive series of horse shows and competitions that we have now. When I competed in 1965 on the East Coast, there were probably 200 members of what was then the U.S. Combined Training Association, USCTA. That has now become the USEA, U.S. Eventing Association, 200 members. And Gladstone had a show jumping coach, Bert Denemethy, and an eventing coach, a Hungarian named Stefan von Visy. And they selected 10 jumper riders and 10 eventers. And we came back, and it was not a head-to-head competition. It was a 2-week clinic. And we rode every day for hours in the hot New Jersey sun with these 2 former military officers. I'm sure going back inside and giggling at the stuff that we would get up to and the mistakes that we would make. But I survived the cut and was invited to stay at Gladstone. And I trained at Gladstone. I went back to the University of Colorado in the fall of '65 and finished my degree, almost finished my degree. And then I trained at Gladstone 1966, 67, 68, up to the Mexico Olympics. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to describe the role that Gladstone had because it's so different now, because there are so many good trainers with their own facility and their own program. And the facilities now are far more modern and far more suitable for training international horses and riders than Gladstone. Gladstone is wonderful, but it's wonderful historically. It's not really applicable presently.
First, I wanted to give a reminder out to our audience. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments box. We would love to hear them. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the differences between facilities then and facilities now. What are some of the main differences you noticed?
Gladstone was cutting edge in the early mid '60s because it had an indoor arena. It was named Nautical Hall, based on Hugh Wiley's wonderful Palomino show jumper, Nautical, who was the star of The Horse with the Flying Tail, the Disney. If you're staying up late at night, you can find that still. And they dedicated this hall to Nautical, the riding hall. It was a huge metal building, and it was, in the summer, it was the hottest oven the world has ever seen. And in the winter, it was colder than Nome, Alaska. So we had the whole spectrum. Modern arenas are lit, and they have air conditioning and heating and so on. And we had none of that. The outdoor arena, this estate, Gladstone, was originally owned by a man named James Brady, who was a very, very wealthy financier. And Jim Brady would drive his coach and four from the mansion close to the stables. And he would drive every morning down to the railroad station, park his four in hand, get off, get on his private club car, and go into New York to go to work. That was how he commuted.
Wow.
In the early 1900s, they traveled with some style. And his groom would then take the horses back and meet the train that evening, and he would drive home again. And the stables were designed for his driving horses, his cargo carriage horses. And the big arena there was nothing but a sand track around the outside and a grass lawn. And so we became space age because the spring before I got to Gladstone, 1965, they cleaned that arena out and put in sand footing. So we could ride in the rain. We could work on this footing and not tear it up. And this was a revelation at the time. Nobody had an outdoor arena. Nobody had an indoor arena. We all just rode in grass ovals. You know, Devon was all grass. The Devon Horse Show, famous horse show, that was all grass. The Upperville Hunter Show, that was all grass. There was no prepared footing in those days. Try that these days. People won't show up now. The Gladstone was special because of the facilities, for sure, but it was also special because of the quality of instruction there. These were the Olympic coaches. Bert DeNemethy, by the mid-'60s, had established himself as the premier show jumping coach in the world. And his riders were the most stylish and technically correct of them in the world. And the man that I mentioned, the team captain, Bill Steinkraus, he was the most technically proficient and correct of those riders. So the quality of instruction was unmatched in the U.S. or really anywhere around the world. And the results that those teams produced in the 1960s, the U.S. was a real powerhouse in 2 out of the 3 disciplines. Dressage was still trying to grow up as a sport in this country. But show jumping, we were a threat to win every time we showed up. Eventing, we got 3 silver medals in a row. 64, 68, 72. Gladstone was the training ground for those Olympic teams, and the medals came as a result of that. Why was Gladstone important? Why is it important now? It's because it produced winners.
We have another reader question. So it says, "Hi Jimmy, what did you think of the cross-country course in Tokyo?"
Hi Sue, I thought it was terrific. I have to tell you, I am prejudiced because Derek DeGrazia is a former student of mine. I was always impressed with his riding skills. He never found the horse. Everybody's got a horse they can ride at that level. But in order to win medals, you don't have a horse, you have the horse. And he never was able to find the horse that took him where his technical skills should have taken him. Fortunately for us, he's translated all of that feel over to his cross-country design. I thought he did a good job there. He tested people, but he didn't punish people. We saw a couple of slip-ups. We saw a couple of pop-offs. Those are inevitable riding at speed up and downhill. But they're at a minimum. The course was marvelously well built. I think I never heard one rider say that it was too much or it wasn't enough. They all thought it was just exactly what was needed for the Olympic level. Terrific course.
Can you give an example of something on a course that would be a punishment, as you were describing?
In the past, we have jumped into deep water. We've jumped into water jumps that had uncertain footing. The footing varied according to where you entered the water. We had fences that were too difficult for tired horses. The Serpent at the World Championships in 1978 is the usual example given for that. It was too big a question too late in the course. It might have ridden well earlier, 5 minutes earlier during the horse's exertions, but it crossed the line from difficult to impossible at that point.
Again, audience, if you have any other questions, we would love to have them. So earlier you were talking about the horse. Which was the horse for you?
Well, I was lucky. I didn't have the horse. I had 2 horses. I was riding Atos. I was trying out for the World Championships in 1966. It was obvious I was not going to be rich and famous riding Atos. Because people were already dealing with very, very fancy thoroughbreds and 7/8 breds horses. And Atos just could not move with those horses in the dressage. And lo and behold, my mother called and said that she had bought a horse named Kilkenny for me. And Kilkenny at that time was a 9-year-old Irish 7/8 bred, probably 15, 16 thoroughbred, by an Irish stallion named Water Serpent. And Water Serpent had gotten a lot of very good jumpers over the years in the early 50s, mid 50s. And Kilkenny was he went to badminton in 1964 with an Irish rider named Tommy Brennan. He went to badminton. He went to Tokyo. The horse was 6th there. The Irish did not really have an eventing team in off years. So the following years, in 1965, Tommy Brennan, who was a professional show jump rider, just took Kilkenny along. Kilkenny jumped 6'3" at Rotterdam. in the summer of 1965. And then Tommy rode him again on their world championship team at Burley, the first world championships, and the Irish team got the gold medal there. And at age 9, they figured that Kilkenny was too old now to last, but he would make a wonderful schoolmaster for me while I was learning my trade, and it would give me a horse that was competent and more or less competitive at the levels. And so my mother bought him for a very reasonable price. I mean, people laugh now when I tell them what we bought a gold medal team winning horse for $7,500. They can't believe it. You can't ship a horse from Europe for that now. and so he arrived in February of 1967. And in 3 months, I had won the national championships on him and been on the gold medal Pan American Games team. Some schoolmaster. He went to 2 more Olympics with me, 68 and 72. We went back to badminton. He won, as I said, he won the national championships, and he won the individual bronze at the world championships in 1970. And this was all on a horse that the Irish team thought was washed up, ridden by a kid that no one thought would ever amount to anything. And then, and this brings me back to your question, and then I found the horse, and Kilkenny was the horse. And when I retired him, I had a whole bunch of horses, but I did not have the horse, and I did not win anything above the preliminary level for 6 years. And then a friend of mine in England called and told me about a horse named Carowitch. And I had seen Carowitch at badminton the year before, and he had stopped at the vet check and stopped and looked at me. And he turned his neck and looked right at me, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck because I had the feeling that he had stopped and he was looking at me. And the groom tugged on the shank. They were supposed to keep walking. This was at the first vet inspection, and he didn't listen to her. And she finally yanked him and said, "Come on, and we've got to walk." And he walked on. And I was standing with Lars Sederholm at the time in the courtyard there at badminton. And I grabbed him and I said, "Who was that?" And he looked and he laughed and he said, "Oh, that's Carowitch. He's wonderful, but you'll never buy him." And I said, because Lars knew that I needed another horse to try out for the World Championships the following year. So lo and behold, December of 77, he called me and said that he had several horses he wanted to show me. And by the way, he had just hung up with Carowitch's owners, and the rider was pregnant, and they were going to put him on the market. And I said, "Well, call them back and tell them that he's sold pending vet." I never sat on him. I never sat on Kilkenny until they got to this country. And I got a leg up on Carowitch the first day when he got here in early 78. And I felt as if I were putting my hand into a glove. And he was the horse, and he rescued my career because I was just about to give up and go to full-time teaching. And Carowitch came along, and I had another 3 years. I won the national championships on him, individual silver in the alternate Olympics, went around badminton, just had the most wonderful experience with him.
Oh my gosh, it was like fate. Like, I mean, it is fate. There's no like about it. It's not a metaphor.
Yes. In my book, I talk about standing in the shadow of the rainbow. And that's an expression the Native Americans have when a human has experienced something unique in nature, some unusual connection with the natural world. They say that person has been standing in the shadow of the rainbow. And I feel like I've been standing in the shadow of the rainbow my whole life. And I certainly was the day that Carowitch picked me out of the crowd.
It's just so magical. Well, it looks like we have one more question. I've never jumped, but I've always wondered if the Arabian breed, because of the endurance bred into them, might ever do good in eventing?
I think Andrew Hoy, who won the bronze medal in Tokyo 2 weeks ago, could give you a better answer about that than I can, because his horse is an Anglo-Arab. And if you saw how fresh and alive and alert that horse was, you would see the endurance aspect of the Arabians in them. I did not see it on television, but Andrew reported later that he got on him before the show jumping started, warming him up, and the horse bucked. And this is at a competition where a lot of the horses were obviously tired after 8 minutes of galloping and jumping. Right. And this horse comes out the next day looking for work because he doesn't feel as if he's been anywhere.
Oh my gosh,
I love Arabs. At one time, the Arabian breed had just started having Arabian hunter classes. And a man sent me an Arabian stallion. Raffles El Rafiq had been a champion in several different divisions. And Mr. Ballard wanted this horse to be a champion jumper also. He saw an opportunity. This was a marketing strategy of his. And he said, I'll send him to you for 30 days. Gretchen, that Arabian, 30 days later, won a training level cross-country event.
Oh my gosh.
He won a training level event up in Pennsylvania.
Did you give him back after those 30 days?
I had to give him back, but I loved him. He was so smart. If you showed him something, he not only he understood it and did it, but he would do it again the next day, absolutely foot perfect. He was almost eerie to work with. Yes,
my mother was raised with horses and doesn't particularly like them, but she loves Arabs. And that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's see, we have another question. Let's see what it is. Do you think rows and tracks should be brought back?
Well, Sue, it is back in the classic format. They still do that. They had a very, very well attended classic 3-day event in Montana last weekend. And I think they had about 40 or 50 horses, and they all did roads and tracks and steeplechase, roads and tracks, cross country, the old classic format. Now, these were at lower speeds and distances than the Olympics. We're not talking about 22 miles, but we're also talking about amateur riders who are intrigued by the combined nature and the difficulty of training and preparing and competing with a classic horse. So do I think they should be back? Not at the Olympic level, no. But for the average amateur rider, the classic format is your Olympics.
What is one thing that has surprised you since about eventing, and especially eventing at the Olympic level now, since you won your silver medal in 1968, since you won that first one?
Well, we're not really comparing sports. Mine was a totally different sport. Speed, endurance, the old scoring system, the ratio of the phases was 3 to 12 to 2. 3 parts dressage, 12 parts cross country, 2 parts show jumping. That was supposed to be the relative balance of those 3 disciplines. The modern event is 1 to 1 to 1. So you have to be equally proficient in all 3 phases. The horses that we rode in the classic format over the Olympic speed and distance, those were real warriors. Michael Page talks about Grasshopper, who he rode in 2 Olympics. He got the bronze medal in he was 4th in 1964. With him in Tokyo. And at the end of 22 miles, he had difficulty pulling Grasshopper up because Grasshopper wanted to keep galloping.
Oh my gosh.
So that was a different individual altogether.
What excites you about today's competitors? You do a lot of coaching now.
I do a lot of coaching now. The exciting thing now is how good these riders' skill sets are. which of course means that I've had to expand and improve my own skill sets in the other two disciplines. I was always comfortable with cross country, and I still am, because there's some aspects of riding at speed, uphill and down dale, those don't change. The technical aspects, the increased collection in the dressage, the increased height and technicality of the show jumping, that's intriguing. That's difficult. I've had to keep growing with the sport, and so that keeps me interested in the morning.
What does your coaching schedule look like now?
My schedule, like now, I have a day off. I've got to take a dog to the vet, and I've got to do some counseling. I'm a video coach for riders at other parts of the country, and I have some conferences tomorrow that I'll do from where I am now. On Friday, I'll be coaching. I get the weekend off, and on Monday, I'll be riding, not coaching. Following Tuesday, I'll be doing a cross-country clinic in Maryland, and then we'll be coming back, and there's a big international event 10 days from now here in Virginia at Great Meadow. And that will be 4-star, 3-star, and 2-star, I believe. So there's a lot going on in the next 10 days for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is the biggest piece of advice that you have to offer riders today? Riders today,
ride every kind of horse that you can over as wide a spectrum as you can. By that, I mean you should be able to ride a horse in collection and dressage, and you should be able to sit correctly on a racehorse and control them and maintain their rhythm even at a high rate of speed, and all of the various things that happen in between dressage and collection on one side and going 30 miles an hour on the other. Be able to ride across that spectrum. Specialize, of course, but generalize, because horses are horses. Ride.
So I have one last question, and of course, audience, if you have any more, please let us know. What do you think it is about horses themselves, right? You talked about being still horse crazy. Horses themselves that keeps you in it, not just the sport, but the actual animals.
I don't know. They just have a magical attraction. There's some people that keep hamsters. I don't think one gets the same thrill from a pet hamster as one does galloping down to a big cross-country fence. But that's just me. I'm not sure it can be explained. It's just I'm horse crazy, and I'm guilty as charged.
Well, fantastic. Well, Jim, thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Of course, check out the book on Equishopper. It is absolutely fabulous. Make sure you pick up a copy. And we will see you next month. Thanks, Jim. Bye.
Thank you, Gretchen. Good night.